Yeah, Peter, I should say, I don't know whether I'm going to make you blush or horrified, but you've got your BFI season, you've had your BAFTA fellowship, not that long ago, your BAFTA kind of British Film Award. You're part of the establishment, whether you like it or not. How does that feel?
Well, wasn't it David Hockney said, if you get to your 80th birthday and you can still boil an egg, watch out, you'll kill a medal on you. No, it just seemed, I suppose, gradually, I suppose, to have come in maybe from the cold. But maybe the cold wasn't so cold even to begin with.
And I know that you are quite vocal about the importance of film and how important film is, and you often, I've seen in interviews, have talked about really your love is the artistic side in terms of painting and sort of some of the exhibition work that you do, and you've sort of sometimes talked about the film side of both your career and generally as being the less important bit. But we're here today with a massive body of work. You're continuing to make films now. So is that one of the Greenaway provocations, or is that really genuinely what you feel?
Well, I don't know. I don't want to, disappoint or irritate in extreme cinema fans, but can we live without cinema?
No, we can't.
You're saying that as a professional, aren't you? But then you very quickly rejoined my criticism by saying, can we live without painting? And I would have a great problem saying yes to that. But I mean, an awful lot of people do live without painting.
And you say that as a professional?
Well, I enjoy the word amateur because it has the word love in it. And I certainly enjoy making films. But if there was a question of taking away painting from my life and taking away cinema, I would let cinema go first.
Okay, well, that's fair enough. Okay. I mean, it's not fair enough. I don't believe that from my point of view, but I accept that's your position.
There's an ephemerality, isn't there, about cinema? I mean, the very fact that, the present organization of the technologies of cinema are rapidly changing. Every 3 or 4 years, there's a new way of imagining things, which somehow doesn't it suggest its curious ephemerality? I don't know how far back you want to go with painting, but they say cave painting 45,000 years ago. There's been an awful lot of painting, even if you could consider cave painting as painting. And an awful lot of practitioners and a huge amount of work that's existed in this huge stretch of time. But if we all think, some people don't necessarily agree with this, that cinema was invented in, the last years of the 19th century, we've only had about 125 years of cinema, which is no comparison at all for the huge, huge breadth worldwide of the possibilities of the business of painting. The simple longevity is not obviously an excuse to put one above the other, but my God, there is a way in which the business of painting does seem to me to be very, very profound in the human condition. And we have, I'm repeating myself now, we've had an awful lot of time when we never had any cinema. And did we feel any the weaker or the more miserable or the more impoverished because of it?
I think I love the collaborative experience that goes into making cinema. Obviously, it's a Greenaway film, but actually it's a Greenaway film with a lot of different people who have combined with you to make the work. And obviously the combined experience of we're here together, laughing together, crying together. It's a very emotional experience, which you may well say is the same when you're in a gallery and looking at a great work. But I think there is something quite different.
But I mean, there's a fault line in your argument, isn't it? Most of us nowadays do not watch films in company.
Well, I guess that's true in terms of the streaming sense. I mean, we're in a temple to film here, in a sense, and you're right. We are the cult of film
yeah, I mean, you're a dying breed, aren't you? Most people do watch their films, for better or for worse, alone, either in a private space, like sitting on the sofa in the front room, or even in bed, which is even more enjoyable. Or they watch it in a workplace because it's part and parcel of the current sort of vocabulary that we all utilize. But the ideas, I mean, cinema was invented as a public entertainment, and people went to see films en masse. And the other phenomenon, of course, is huge numbers of people saw the same film at the same time. And that doesn't really happen quite so much as it used to do. So, when we talk about cinema now, are we actually agreeing that cinema now is like the cinema of the 1900s? And there is a big difference.
And how does it make you feel in terms of, you make a film to be seen on the big screen. You've made it in a particular way. It suits the big screen experience. I mean, I kind of feel like watching, a Greenaway film on a laptop is a bit like buying a postcard of a great painting in the National Gallery, because you haven't made it to be seen that way, have you?
That's true, and I think the trailer you showed it was deliberately for a big screen. And that's really, it's a sort of a bit of a contradiction, isn't it, in terms of cinema in 2022? We should all really be making, if it's still believed that cinema is a mass entertainment, certainly concentrating on the televisual characteristics of the idea of the moving image rather than the big screen. I don't know, it is a contradiction, but then maybe the most interesting people are always contradictory.
I wonder if we could talk about your time at the Central Office of Information, which is where I think you sort of honed some of your craft.
Yeah, it's just down the road here.
Yeah.
It's just round the back of the railway station here. And I was there for, 8 or 9, 10 years. And it certainly was very instrumental. COI, Central Office of Information, something that sounds like a Russian Politburo, doesn't it? And maybe in some peculiar circumstances it was a bit like that. And you know this film history better than I do, it was part of during the Second World War, thanks maybe, I suppose, to the experiences, negative very largely, of Goebbels, who created a fantastic propaganda machine in order to support the German war effort. And I think, the British, I suppose, yes, we could say the British. I was just thinking then most of the people of the war years of war propaganda were curiously Scottish in a curious way. I think of people like Grierson. They copied, I suppose, certainly not his direct ideas, but his notion of how important cinema was. I mean, very important film directors like Eisenstein and the Russians understood that even more so beforehand. And I was always aware that when I was working for the COI, I was creating propaganda of a sort. Let's hope it was positive, though I could, to my shame, indicate certain elements of that activity which was certainly not positive. But I could see all the time how the films were being made and for what purposes. I was working for the COI in the big period of the 60s when people like the Beatles, I think I made the very first film about the Beatles, for example, and we went on making films about, because they were very, very good propaganda for the British way of life. But, Hovercraft was in there and Concorde was in there and so on and so on. All those things have passed away now, but they still exist there on a lot of the COI films, which, first of all, as an editor and then as an editor-director, I participated in.
And those short films that you made, I guess, during your time at the COI as well, the not COI kind of approved films, so to speak, you take some of those ways of making the sort of COI films and you've applied them into your own films. Sure. I wonder if you could just talk a little bit about, sort of some of those films, like, A Walk Through H, or some of,
Yeah, list making, a characteristic which I think is part and parcel of my film vocabulary even now, was something I learned from the COI. The COI were very keen on making lists. There's this, and there's this, and there's this, and there's this. And this is how you first of all, you introduce the wide shot, then the medium shot, then the close-ups, and then you probably utilize all the good things and the bad things about the voiceover commentaries, which were often telling you outright lies while showing you something completely different. So the picture and the soundtrack didn't really meet in a satisfactory way. That was often maybe the results of all sorts of things which are very extra frame, relative, of course, to the producers, certainly at the COI too. But no, I mean, I would agree with you. The actual language of COI production was telling me all the time, maybe, that I could try and use that sort of language and be very self-conscious about the notions of propaganda to inform the particular fictions that I wish to portray. We've talked about this before, but if I could mention it again, I made a big film called The Falls, great sprawling encyclopedia, and it's full of arcane facts and a huge amounts of apocrypha, and a lot of it was completely and absolutely untrue. But at the same time, I made a film called Act of God, which was about people being struck by lightning. And we did a huge amount of research, not just me, but all the team that was surrounding me, and we put advertisements in national newspapers asking people to come forward with their experience of being struck by lightning. And as you can imagine, a lot of the experiences of these people was incredibly bizarre and unbelievable. So I ended up with two films virtually made at the same time. The Falls, which was basically 99% fiction, people believed. And the film about being struck by lightning, people said, no, this is not true. So again, you know, maybe with our current terms about, you know, the artificial like and Trumpism, et cetera, has now peculiarly, post George Orwell, I suppose, come very much full-fronted in our experiences. What is a lie? What is the truth?
I mean, that's a profound question, and I guess, you know, as you say about the Falls, in fact, we're going to show a clip of it in a minute, so thank you for your segue there. But you know, I think the Falls is, you know, it's a great mockumentary, but not, as you say, always seen by people at the time. I mean, it's almost, I think it's about, in fact, it's about 3 hours long. It's
Indeed.
Very long.
Yes.
But very funny. But I think there were people who probably watched it not realizing it was meant to be funny and therefore kind of puzzled by it,
right.
and other people who found it probably, you know, hilarious.
Yeah, even the way we made it, I mean, because it's so incredibly long, you know, it sort of test your patience. And I tried to somehow make it, if I could use a phrase, like an ambulatory film. You remember one of the characteristics of the promenade concerts, the people were allowed to wander in, listen to a piece of music, and then go and have a cup of coffee or go to the bathroom, whatever else, and come back, and nobody would be particularly upset about that. And I imagine The Falls would be like an ambulatory film. You could leave it whenever you want, when you got pissed off with it, and then you could come back again.
I guess there are some of your films that people took that approach as well, unfortunately.
I think they might have done, yes.
The premise of the film is about a particular event, isn't there? It's a violent, unknown event, and there are survivors, and you've taken a sort of the FALL part of the directory, and you've kind of tracked those people down in order.
Yeah, and there are all sorts of cross-references. For example, it is made up of biographies, and there are 92 of them. And 92 is the atomic number of uranium. And I am a young man in the 60s, marching to, you know, bomb the man marches, etc. So that was part and parcel of the political background. And it's played with repeatedly. And number 92 has remained, I think, a significant number in my games of number playing and alphabets, etc., ever since. And maybe, you know, with our concerns about global warming and, you know, the problems about power and how we're going to keep our fridges humming for the next 1,000 years, that we're going to have to accept or find some way that the notions of atomic power are going to come back very seriously in our lives. So it has a certain sort of presaging notion, and I think its messaging is, you know, still very current and important for us in the year 2022.
And interestingly, the character of tullooper occurs, a character you go back to, and it was also the connection with 92 there in the tullooper sense, but we'll probably come back to that later on. But for the moment, can we watch the first clip, please, the clip from The Falls?
You know, the film obviously is very self-reflexive. You see the BFI gets clobbered somewhere there. But I mean, that young man who was offering it is Chris Pettit. You have long memories? Remember Radio On? You know, long time. So again, it's self-reflexive, and that I'm actually employing other filmmakers to help me make the fiction.
And in terms of just watching that then and thinking about the falls, obviously you talked about the sort of, the numbers of 92, and there's that 1 to 100 and Drowning by Numbers, and I mean these number games and kind of puzzles and kind of games that kind of make up your films are something that you enjoy playing with.
Yeah, I was always and still am a bit reticent about the notion how films are made. It's very difficult for me to go to a producer. Indeed, I suspect any would-be filmmaker to go to a producer, with 4 paintings, 3 lithographs, and a book of drawings and say, give me the money. They need a script. So what does that mean about cinema? Cinema, in a curious way, these are big, bold statements, but let me make them, is an illustrational medium. It's illustrating text. And that is the way, all major mainstream cinema is basically created. Does that mean that all producers are visually illiterate? Do they understand images? Do they understand what images do and what they stand for? Or do they need a text to be able to understand what should be made and how it should be made? And that seems to be a big fault line about the way that we manufacture cinema. It need not have been like that. We've ended up very largely with a cinema of illustrated text. That's putting it very bluntly and very sort of provocatively. But it has in its understanding of the situation an absolute truth. I think we've ended up with a cinema of writers, and we should have ended up with a cinema of painters.
And there was a from the audience there, and even a small round of applause from the front row. But
there must be painters in the audience. Put your hands up, all you people who are painters. I mean, basically, although I'm offering you provocations, what I'm saying is true, isn't it? Cinema is meant to be a medium about images, not about text. But we fall back again on all the literary tropes and paradigms. And this has been true, ever since Charlie Chaplin. It's been constantly true, and it's still very much true.
I mean, you're talking about sort of tropes and so forth, and I guess the big thing, moving on to the Draftsman's Contract, which to a lot of people is your first sort of feature film. Obviously there is The Falls, it's unmistakably a feature film, but in terms of somebody I know who talks about non-narrative, but it's the first kind of proper narrative film. Framing, obviously, is such an important part of that film, both in terms of the kind of the conceit of the film itself, in terms of Mr. Neville and his sort of framing device and so forth. But that's an incredibly important part of your films, and I guess culture generally in a major way.
Right. There's no such thing as a frame in nature, is there? There's no such thing as a frame. I'm not looking at you through a frame, and you're certainly not looking at me through a frame. So it's an artificiality of cinema number one. There is no such thing as a frame in nature. So we're already creating something which is boldly artificial. I would argue that artificiality of cinema is what makes it so exciting. And therefore, let's make an emphasis about it. So, the film, The Draftsman's Contract, I'm throwing the frame in your face all the time. We're actually using a late 18th century device, which is not my invention. It actually existed. Draftsmen actually used this sort of frame, which had a grid which helped them to understand perspective and so on and so on. And also, again, the whole of The Draftsman's Contract really, again, using a piece of text, is a frame-up. So the poor man, the draftsman, is being framed in the other use of that term, as opposed to actually the metaphorical use of the notion of the medium. And again, this is part again of that self-reflexivity, that acknowledgement that films is only a film is only a film. When you watch a Greenaway film, it's not a slice of life. It's not a window on the world. It's just a film.
And I guess, that kind of, you play with the notions of that kind of artifice, I think, a lot in your films. I think of some of the films like The Cook, the Thief, or Gulches and the Pelican Company, where it's very, very clear that these are films being made in a studio. There's no sense of trying to recreate a kind of historical setting in an old home in the way that you do with draftsman's contract. And I guess that's part of your cinema, is about the fact that you're recognising the artifice and you're kind of almost celebrating that very sort of, self. It's very clear, I think, that it's a film, and you're not hiding for that.
Yeah. And so, if you imagine from what I'm saying that I distrust the notion of the primacy of the image actually in a cinematic medium, which is all meant to be about images, there is a way that I distrust the notion of narrative. And narrative, I think, we associate very much with literature, certainly for thousands of years with poetry, but since, I don't know, 1650s, 1700s, with the novel form, which is predominant in our literature now, there's a way, I've always eschewed the notion of wishing to simply turn books into films. And I've never really done that. I made a film called The Pillar Book, and I made another film called Prospero's Book, so I'm acknowledging again, that English phrase, if it itches, you have to scratch it. If I'm going to complain about literature, you're going to get this. Let me push it. And my films are often full of writing on the screen, again, which is part and parcel of the same phenomenon. I actually liked, the calligraphic art, and I like, watch Prospero's books, extraordinary, beautiful calligraphy, and see it being made. And the Pillar Book really is, I think, a whole film is about calligraphy, not so much maybe any more Western art, but certainly alive and well in Japan and China to a certain extent. So again, that's all part and parcel, again, of you're only watching a film. This is an artifice. Enjoy it for its artificial nature.
I do struggle with the whole thing about being non-narrative when the film as a medium is clearly a very narrative form, particularly as
Is it? Is it really? Are you really telling me a truth?
Well, I'm thinking about like The Cook, the Thief, His Wife, No Lover, for example. I can't think of a more narrative-driven film than that in some respects.
And I suppose you could follow up by saying that the genre narrative is a very familiar one, the revenge drama, which has been with cinema ever since its inception.
Pity she's a whore, and
Yeah, that's true. Well, as I said, all the most interesting people are full of contradictions.
And the landscape, obviously, is we see in the draftsman's contract, and that feels to be like in your DNA. I think your dad was an ornithologist, and earlier you were talking about sort of the English countryside as being one of the only things you perhaps miss. Now you don't live in the UK anymore.
That is true. That is true. Be careful, though, because, there's a way when you ask me questions, I'm very good at inventing answers, which might not necessarily be the truth. You know that phrase, never let the truth get in the way of a good story.
And, in terms of the lengths of the films you made, like Draftsman's Contract, I think you made about 4 hours of film. It was initially going to be 4 hours long at one point before you had to cut it down. Do you find that editing process very difficult when it's your own film?
Yes, I mean, I think there are one or two people maybe in the audience tonight who I've collaborated with on the editing, and they know that these films go on and on and on and on and on for the first beginning. And I think The Falls initially was something about, 6 hours long, impossible length. Practical reasons like money and, patience and so on are also things that begin to curtail. But you're right about the Draftsman's Contract. It was very long to begin with. And I think the greatest difficulty we had was, in fact, cutting the thing down.
I think we have got John Wilson here, and I think we may have Chris Wyatt as well. Is that right? Are they both editor Greenaway collaborators here? Certainly we have John here anyway. John, just give a wave, because John worked on most of your early films, so it's great to have you. I think a big round of applause for John being here. I never imagined it can be an easy job editing a film with somebody who is an editor.
Well, I don't know. Maybe you should ask him.
So maybe we'll leave that one for another time. But in terms of thinking about, once again, the Draftsman's Contract, and in some of your films, you've talked about kind of trying to find your kind of personal identity and almost about kind of reconnecting with your father through some of your films. And I remember you talking with the Draftsman's Contract and other films about kind of innocence and arrogance, if you like, in like Mr. Neville. There were even to Albert Spicker in terms of his kind of horrible villain though he is. But I just wanted to just talk a little bit more about that element from in terms of the reconnection with your father.
Okay, I don't want to embarrass myself or you by talking about personal anecdotes, but I never got on very well with my father. I think it was because I'd chosen to wish to become a painter, and he was fully aware that very few painters actually are successful financially. We can obviously put certain people on one side, think of Andy Warhol, for God's sake. But there is a way in which that antagonism was part of a situation which I never felt very comfortable about. And when I started having children of my own, that I realized that necessarily I ought to make peace with all this antagonism that existed between father and son. But just as I was about to do that, unfortunately he died of stomach cancer, and opportunities were missed. And there was always a feeling, I got to try to be as honest as I can here, that a lot of my early films were about that dialogue I should have had with my father. So a lot of the minor figures, even something about tullooper, and certainly you're absolutely right about the draftsman. Again, you know, I don't want to, you know, make comments which are very difficult to back up. But that mixture of arrogance and innocence, which were characteristics, I think, not only of me, but certainly of my father, were very foremost. And even, again, you are right to mention the fact there are qualities about the character of the thief in The Cook and the Thief is also part and parcel of that phenomenon. I think I've laid all those ghosts to rest now. And I don't think the image of the unspoken conversation I should have had with my father, I don't think it haunts me as much as it certainly did once upon a time.
And one of the things we try and do here at the BFI is, you know, we try and show 35mm prints as well as digital prints, and sometimes we kind of wrestle between the two. And right, for The Cook, the Thief's Wife and Lover, which we're going to be playing after this, we originally thought we were going to be able to play a 35mm print, but actually it had too much damage to really do it justice, so it will be a digital copy. But as a filmmaker, do you have a feeling about how you like your films to be presented in terms of either format?
Well, the comment you made about widescreen cinema, big image to play with, that is maybe part of that answer, and I'm certainly against, you know, all the suitable evidence to suggest that's not the way we ought to be making cinema anymore. I would still hang on to that, and I'm grateful that I'm allowed to do that. But again, thinking about the practices of painting, where you can actually manipulate everything on the canvas or whatever you're painting on, always seemed to be a downside in the actual notions of making cinema. So when the digital vocabularies begin to, I don't know what we're talking, 1983, I was absolutely delighted, because you can, in a peculiar way, with all the complexities of reimagining and reworking the actual surface, you could become a painter all over again. But isn't it curious, and I'm sure it's a sort of human characteristic, we invent the most extraordinary new languages, and somehow or other, though maybe for a honeymoon period we actually play with them with great excitement and great sense of invention, but eventually we come back to our comfort zone again. And there is a way the digital revolution has somehow become peculiarly sort of debased. You know, we have all these amazing, Star Wars phenomenon, but they are very basically the cinema that was still being used by Griffiths. There's not much really changed. And all these extraordinary inventions of 3D cinema. Where did 3D cinema go? It was meant to be, it wasn't a great opening out. But now, apart from one or two maybe Japanese films intended for children, there aren't many people actually playing with the notions of the invention of 3D cinema.
You're right, although you say that in the week that Avatar is about to come out. So.
Well, I think that's a good example. I mean, just think, his actual filmmaking, sorry, Mr. Cameron, but is really very, very orthodox. His plots, come on, Avatar, the universe.
He may be more non-narrative than you are.
Well, maybe that's the truth. But the idea of the universe being saved by a one-legged American Marine, it's a crazy, crazy, crazy idea. And, the props and the tropes and the death, love, angle, and so on, and adventure and the chase, and so on and so on. It's very, very conventional and was invented by Méliès and Lumière hundreds of thousands of years ago. So there is an actual way that these new inventions don't really change the really nature of cinema. They just play with its superficialities. And let me repeat again, human imagination begins to return back to its comfort zone, to find out, to go back, I know how to do this, but I'll use this brand new language to tell the stories in the old-fashioned way. And that's tragic, I think. And why do we behave like that? I don't know. You, as a much more profound watcher of cinema than even I am, I don't go to cinema very often, must also feel that to be sort of a form of disappointment. Cinema really has been a disappointment, don't you think?
I don't. I don't, but I love the fact you do, and I believe you. I'm going to go with something you said, because you gave me a perfect segue, actually. When you talked about a one-legged marine, we're going to play the first few minutes of Z2 Noughts now, and there is a one-legged gorilla in that film. So that's given me my kind of rather tenuous way of...
Yeah, it gets even worse, because there is the major female has got no legs at all.
That is true. So can we play a clip 2, the Z2 Noughts clip, please? That's an incredible opening sequence. Just one thing I must just point out, your next film after this was Belly of an Architect, and if you are eagle-eyed on that newspaper, there's a reference to architect dying and a direct reference to the film and a story about the architect. At that point, I guess you knew that was about to be made, did you?
Yes, I try to do that repeatedly. There is a feeling that an artist basically makes one work, and all the parts, however they are when they're painted, if you're a painter, when you're 18 or when you're 85, they all are essentially part and parcel of the same phenomenon. And I was always interested in doing that. It's a sort of game as well, but that sort of device appears again and again and again. I always have a lot of scripts on the go, certainly have now. Chances of actually making them, as I get older and older, of course, become less and less possible. But that notion, again, I sort of, again, like to play with. But you could see here that there's all sorts of... I'd forgotten about it. I don't know whether John remembers it as well, or forgets it as much as I... But my God, there are all sorts of, tales within tales and games within games. Just take the title, A Z and Two Noughts. The two main protagonists have names Oliver and Oswald, so therefore the two noughts. Z in the whole film is about about zebras, and Z is the last letter of the alphabet. So already we're game playing. So, before a critic even sees the film, he has to wrestle with the title, for God's sake. I thought I never ought to do that again. So a bit later on, of course, I made a film with a very, very simple title. The Cook, the Thief, his wife, and her lover. I thought, I'm safe here now. Even the French won't be able to fuck it up and get completely confused. But again, anybody who speaks French, there's a great problem about female and male pronouns. And before I knew it, the cook, the thief, his wife, and her lover became a very complicated homosexual drama. So, watch out for words.
I always think of some of the amazing casts you've worked with, and perhaps we'll talk about this later on, but I should reference, I don't even know if you remember him now, but you do have Jim Davidson in that film, the kind of famous sort of blue comedian, which I always think is kind of interesting, like one of those kind of trivia kind of pub questions that people always like.
Right.
I think, I don't know why I felt I needed to share that with you, but I've got it off my chest now.
No, but I think, I thoroughly enjoyed his vulgarity. And he's full of blue jokes, and he's always dressed in blue. So for those people who are still awake at the back, they should have got that situation. But of course, watching a very mainstream Hollywood film, there must be 100 ideas in every single film, and the chances of everybody getting every single reference and cross-reference is not very likely. But if there are 100 ideas, maybe different parts of the audience are getting different parts together. And all I'm doing is what mainstream filmmaking is doing all the time. But I am making a requirement of the audience, stay awake, please stay awake. If you don't get that, get this. If you don't get that, get this. And if you don't get any of it, don't worry about it. There's a lot of other things to enjoy.
I have a quote from you. We obviously take, we talked about quotes and things you said in the past. There are filmmakers who seem to be making Greenaway films without Greenaway's name being attached, but that's okay. And I wonder whether there's anybody in particular you're referring to. I mean, I'm thinking this particular film of 7 2 Noughts has a kind of very famous similar.
Have you ever seen a film called Dead Ringers by a very good Canadian filmmaker called Cronenberg? I have actual factual evidence that Dead Ringers is a total rip-off of this film. I know that to be the truth because the film was shown at the Toronto Film Festival, and David took me to a hamburger bar afterwards and sat me down for about 3 hours and asked me endless questions about it. And eventually he ends up with Dead Ringers. He had a lot of money and therefore could employ some really first-rate actors. I'm not saying that our actors are particularly bad, but there is a way he had certain advantages that I did not have at that time when we were making, films for $500,000.
And once again, I don't know whether that was a whim at the time, but you've talked about it as being your favourite film. I mean, is that the case?
Yes, I'm not trying to excuse it. I think a lot of it is overblown and difficult. I think, again, we just saw Chris Pettit. I think he used to be one of the major critics in Time Out when it's first opened here in London. And he said that Greenaway is being far too ambitious, and I would have to agree with him because 7 2 Noughts is really 3 films in one. It's about the doppelganger. I'm deeply curious, and I suspect we all are, what would we do if we met ourselves? How would we react, etc., etc.? Think of our reaction to ourselves in the sexual sphere, for example. But that was one thing. Let's talk about doppelgangers, and it's, again, quite a major theme in all literature and certainly in cinema. But then the second part of the film was the notion of the zoo as an ark, a catalogue, a living catalogue. So all the animals of the zoo and the whole film took place in Rotterdam Zoo. We shot the entire film in a zoo, which was fascinating. And then much more obscure, I was working with a brilliant Russian-originated but French citizen, Sacha Vierney, who had worked with Alain Resnais for a very long time. And Resnais's a filmmaker I enormously enjoy and respect. He also, I think, worked with Buñuel on the Sweet Charm of the Bourgeoisie. And Sacha was intrigued by the Drossums contract, and certainly he came and worked with us, and we made about, I think, 6 films with him. But the third thing was, I think Sacha Vierney's very first film was working with Jean Cocteau way back in 37, 38. So he has a long, long history and a vast knowledge of essentially celluloid cinema vocabulary, but he was gradually beginning to move into the digital revolution. And I suggested, quite playfully to begin with, let's see how many ways, let's imagine the possibility of lighting a film in different ways. So let's come up, let's give ourselves a sort of strategy. We need 26 ways to light a movie. Okay, I can see the moon up there. Daylight, moonlight, starlight even now. I've been making films recently. We just made this film, Walking to Paris, where a lot of the scenes you can actually see the stars, such as the extraordinary quality of filmmaking nowadays. But then let's light by candlelight, let's light by firelight, let's light by cathode tube light, etc., etc. A lot of these devices have been used by Godard, for example. Like when Godard couldn't find enough lights, he would gather all his friends together, ask them to bring their cars and switch their lights on. Devices like that. So we ended up with 26 ways to light a film. And the most absurd ways, I said, let's try and light the film with rainbows. And we did it. So again, that's pretty elitist and private sort of language, and there was game playing between me and the cameraman, but 3 different films which were all pushing and pulling and maybe even being antagonistic to one another But again, it's again the ultimate ludic notion of how to manufacture a movie. And those sorts of characteristics have been part and parcel of a lot of the other movies.
And you talked about Sasha Vierney there, whose work you'd obviously greatly admired in last year in Marienbad and a number of the other films you made. And that's one of a number of kind of collaborations that you had over a number of films, including obviously got John Wilson, who edited a number of films with you, and Keith Cassander, who obviously produced a lot of films. But I think that anybody who loves your films, couldn't let your relationship with Michael Nyman, I think, sort of slip by.
Absolutely.
And I know that was an incredibly important relationship for both of your careers, right up to Prospero's books, where you kind of parted the ways. And I think that people who love film and love the different sort of components, I think we're always kind of devastated when people do sort of part their ways kind of acrimoniously, because we always will long for those relationships to continue. And I think I've got a quote of you saying that Michael Nyman and I had an enormous falling out, a massive divorce. And I wonder, was that an inevitability because you both wanted more control over your own projects? Because you worked in a very unusual way, I think, for most composer-director relationships, in terms of this kind of the freedom that perhaps you allowed him. But was there an inevitability about that falling out? Or could you tell us a little bit more about it, if you don't mind? Or maybe you do.
I think, enough water has passed under the bridge to not be sensitive necessarily about this anymore. There was a way that I had always refused to really allow a composer too much access to the script, because it's back to that wretched word illustration again. I found that composers were illustrating the script, and that was not a good idea. And if you work with a really brilliant collaborator, you must allow him or her absolute space to do what we know they could do extremely well. So the briefest of descriptions of what I intended to do, indeed with the draftsman's contract, were given. And basically I said to Michael, you go away and write the music, whatever you want. And I believe, maybe arrogantly, I have enough experience as an editor to decide what music goes where. And there are characteristics about Michael's music which are full of irony and full of sort of that question we've been talking about self-reflexivity. He's obviously part, I think he actually termed the term minimal, so he was right there with Phil Glass and Steve Reich and all those people in the early 60s coming out of New York. He played in their bands, he was instrumental for a lot of their ideas. So that combination of self-reflexivity and irony, I thought, were good parallels for what I was trying to do, and I think we've actually touched on it in terms of the cinema. So I think it's a very good elaboration. But I think Michael wanted other sorts of things. I felt that I really, should not always continually put all my eggs in the same basket. The world of music is huge. Let me see if I can make other relationships with other composers. And that's, of course, what we did. Michael then went away and made that film, The Piano, with Jane Campion. Yeah. Enormous success. And I think that changed his career to a certain extent. And I, again, moved away maybe to perhaps more esoteric areas. And I think perhaps to answer your question with a big yes, I think there was an inevitability that we would not continue to work together until we were both 80.
So are you telling us something we don't know then? But just in terms of, I'm pushing you a bit like a sort of a tabloid hack now, but in terms of Prospero's books, there was a particular kind of falling out over the use of the music there.
Yes, there is a particular, I don't know whether Michael even now understands it quite in the same way. You remember the great shock horror when Dylan started employing electronic instrumentation. He was always regarded as a particular composer who didn't eschew that sort of language. And I think Michael had some feeling that because of the central device of Prospero's books was to utilize the extraordinary ability of Sir John Gielgud's voice to play everybody. Supposedly, some people would disagree with this, The Tempest is Shakespeare's last play. Incidentally, Gielgud always thought that Shakespeare wrote Prospero just for him. And you can understand. I think Gielgud, had this great antagonism against Laurence Olivier. We're next door here to the National Theatre. Yep. And I think Olivier had many opportunities to put his performances down in cinema. Richard III, Henry V, etc. And Gielgud never had that. So he thought if he could find somebody eventually to utilize his talents, which are essentially, I suppose, his beautiful speaking voice and his understanding of text, then he would be well satisfied. So I think really that's the basis why, although I had worked with him again before that on a version of Dante's Inferno, that was one of the reasons why, in fact, we agreed to see if we could make something of it. So that meant, there are only two females in the Tempest. One is Sycorax, the witch you never see, and the other one is his own daughter, Miranda. No other females. So he was obliged, and I don't know whether you remember or even have some cognizance of that last speech of the Tempest, about, again, self-reflexivity. This is only a stage. We're all characters on a stage, etc. And I wanted and asked if Gielgud would be prepared to voice everybody's character. But I had to do that with some sort of fidgeting about with oral perspectives and so on. So we had to feminize Gielgud's voice, make him sound old, make him so young, make him sound good, make him sound bad. And we use all sorts of tricks. And I think Michael took extreme exception to this. It was an argument we never fully argued out because we were shouting at one another by that time, and I don't think coherent conversation between us was very valuable to either of us. But I always thought that mainly was, I think, almost an aesthetic decision, which caused us maybe to move apart. I also think that Michael was getting a bit fed up with my very short, small budgets for filmmaking.
There are points in your career, I feel, we're going to see The Cook, the Thief, His Wife and Lover, and we're going to talk about that later on, so I'm not going to talk about that now. But I'm thinking about, there's a point in your career around the sort of Baby of Macon, there's the Pillow Book and there's 8.5 Women. And I think, I'm interested to know whether you think what I'm going to say is correct or not, but I have a feeling that there are a lot of people who've been on this journey with you. And then around the time, probably less so with the Pillow Book, but perhaps with the Baby Macon and the sort of the rape scene, which is a difficult scene to watch, but probably particularly with 8.5 Women and some of the sort of issues around the sort of, I guess, the accusations of misogyny and other sort of criticisms that were made, not by everybody by any means, but where some of your viewers or your fans kind of left the train, if you like, and perhaps didn't come back immediately. I mean, is that a fair enough thing to say?
Yes, I think maybe the film you didn't mention was, it was 8.5 Women.
Yeah, 8.5
It was
Women.
extreme misogyny, very deliberately about, male sexual fantasizing regarding, females to fit into a categorization of 8.5 different types of women. So that misogyny was quite blatant and deliberate, but it obviously deeply upset people, and I can perfectly understand that. And so, again, people began to feel that they were not going to be followed and wouldn't particularly be interested in the sort of filmmaking that I was making. I think there's been a general, I don't know if you agree with this, a feeling that a Greenaway film is always basically a Greenaway film, so we're always going in the same direction. But there's no point. It becomes very déjà vu if you keep repeating yourself. So a bit like a sailing ship. You tack, you take a extreme left, and then you go extremely right. So all the films couldn't possibly be the same. So these were my experiments in plotting, in strategies, in, I suppose, philosophical attitudes. And again, even when I listen, indeed, to that rape scene in The Baby of Macon, it is incredibly powerfully distasteful. But perhaps which is even more so, do you remember the first scene in The Cook, Thief, His Wife and Her Lover, where a poor victim gets covered in dog excrement? Yeah. People really shrieked at that. And I know that Channel 4, who had been very generous in funding my filmmaking, the commissioning editor at that time said, no, we can't do this, we can't do this. But there were other people at Channel 4 who were prepared to take the risk. We made it, of course. And then, ironically, Channel 4 had to buy the film, whereas they could have put money into it originally. They had to pay twice as much money afterwards to buy the film back. And The Cook, the Thief, His Wife and Her Lover, I think became a certain calling card for me. I do remember, and I always find this extraordinary, it was fantastically successful in Russia. There was a way, there are major newspapers called Pravda, which we always know is the truth, and the Russians were very careful at understanding, we understand what truth is and what truth isn't. And this is what's going to happen when the Soviet Union collapses and capitalism moves in. And my God, hasn't that proven to be true? The late 80s and the 90s, right up until the Berlin Wall came down, this extraordinary figure played by Michael Gambon so horrendously somehow became very sort of significant. And the other part of this was I was always intrigued, cinema is full of evil characters. It's part of the game that people play, but we all fall in love in a curious way with Scarface, with whoever. Judas Iscariot in some curious way is far more entertaining than Jesus Christ. And then the famous, the English literary characteristic of this is Milton's Paradise Lost, where Satan is really fascinating and Christ is really boring. And, to go to heaven is going to be a tremendous disappointment. But though to go to hell is going to be very, very uncomfortable, it's far more interesting. So the game is, and it's a game I tried self-consciously, was to make a character who was really unforgivably awful, terrible language, appalling misogyny, very bad sense of sadism. And I don't know, everybody loved Michael Gambon in the end, even though he played something really horrendous.
He did play something horrendous, but I guess the script that you gave him, the way it's delivered, a lot of it is actually kind of perhaps quite unconsciously funny as well, though, isn't it? And you do laugh along with him, and that therefore, I guess, builds in an endearing element. And there is an innocence to him as well. When he jumps up and down, when he's getting gleeful, or when he's talking to Georgie about wanting to have a baby and stuff, he goes from being the most outrageously hateful character to suddenly this sort of innocent. So I think that's what paved that way, though, isn't it?
Well, maybe there's a lesson to be learned. The way to kill sadism, to kill cruelty, is to make it an item of humor. That sounds terrifying. But just imagine if people had laughed at Trump at the very beginning, we wouldn't have ended up with the chaos that we ended up with.
Yeah, it's difficult to laugh at him now, isn't it, in a sense, because it's so
well,
horribly real.
It's very noticeable now, isn't it, in the press. There's a slight feeling now, feeling sorry for him in a way that we never felt sorry for him before.
Let's see how we feel in 2024, shall we?
Well, let's see, yes.
I wanted to ask you about, need to move on to our next clip in a moment, and the next clip's from the Pillow book. And I chose this clip partly because I think it's the first time you kind of moved outside of Europe to film something, and it has a very kind of contemporary feel to it in a way that perhaps not many of your films have in the sense it's in a more modern day setting, and because of the use of the sort of digital technology, which you kind of completely embraced with TV Dante, Prospero's books, and so many of your other films. I feel as if you're a real kind of pioneer in that field. I think it's very easy to think about a lot of the big Hollywood films and their use of digital stuff, but actually you were there right at the start, trying it out, paint box technology and so forth. Should we watch the clip and then we'll come back to that perhaps? Sure. We'll hold that thought. Can we play the Pillow book clip, please? I feel as if you've talked a lot about cinema as being dead. It's a childish medium. It's a format that's young and it's going to die very quickly. And so I guess part of your interest has been extended by having new tools to play with and having new toys in the box, so to speak. Can you just tell us a little bit about how you've kind of approached using sort of technology and how you feel that's kind of enhanced your filmmaking?
Well, the device of frames on top of frames, we actually started when we made the Channel 4 version of Dante's Inferno. So that's a sort of flashback to some of the previous language. But the ability, again, to manipulate and to organize the actual, surface characteristics of the notion of celluloid seemed to me, again, like coming home. As I mentioned, you could become a painter all over again. And I wanted to explore that. The Dutch at this particular time were fascinated indeed by this language, and there were lots of very young people, 17, 18, 19, who were queuing into this new language too. And there were all sorts of people interested in my cinema because they could see I had a handle, should we say, on a little bit more money than they did, and therefore maybe they, through me, could be allowed to experiment, so that was very useful. And all these new tools, you're absolutely right, kept coming up. Virtually people were inventing something and utilizing the vocabulary, something new every single weekend. And I was very curious to use that and see if we could make it indeed valuable for a brand new sort of cinema.
Just for my colleagues up in the technical team, we're not going to play the tullooper clip, which I was going to play just for time reasons. We've got another clip, so just to let you know we're not going to play tullooper. But I do want to just briefly talk about tullooper because it's a hugely ambitious project. I mean, I don't think I can think of a more ambitious project in terms of all the different outputs that was due to have. It was due to be 92 films, which I'm not 100% sure you ever really believed it would be, but we'll pass that for a moment. But it's going to be operas, documentaries, a library of books, an exhibition, an interactive TV series, website, 92 characters played by 92 different people. I mean, it's a massive, massive project to have, and actually, if you're ticking things off, you actually tick quite a lot of them off in terms of that ambition. You realised quite a lot of that, didn't you?
Yes. No, I had this idea again. I'd come to a sort of impasse, a sort of déjà vu. I've done that bit. Now let's see if we can regard the notions of contemporary television, indeed contemporary cinema, and make something really brand new. Let's make something for the information age, because there was a way that our tools were far more sophisticated, I believed, than the uses to which we wanted to put them. So this big embrace, ridiculously ambitious, but that's been a characteristic. I think there are so many ridiculous notions of what I've tried to eschew. I mean, like Dante's Divine Comedy consists of 3 parts, and each part has got 33, Age of Christ and his death, cantos. And it's an awful, huge amount of material. And again, Channel 4 were very ambitious and suggested, okay, let's see if we can actually remake this great European classic, which everybody from Milton to Dante to James Joyce has followed on, into something which emboldens our seriousness about television. And, of course, the money ran out after 12 cantos, so there were a huge number we never got to. And there are other projects like that which are almost too ashamed to mention, because even to mention them is how ridiculous. How could you possibly imagine doing that? But I thought the essay to get into them again would be worthwhile. And indeed, you're right. We did make all sorts of I would say, subsidiary opportunities. But I become a VJ then. VJing was like DJing with pictures. And we did set up...
We had you here at the IMAX over the road doing a VJ set.
Yes. And it was very exciting. Again, huge problems and so on. I do remember we did a performance in Sao Paulo where we got the police to shut off all the lights and all the skyscrapers, and there were about 40 skyscrapers, and there was a big boulevard, and I think 10,000 people turned up, and I said, okay, it's VJing, so you can dance if you want, but we will give you this massive amount of material. I think we had 15, different screens, and they were all very big. It was great sort of fantasy, phantasmagoria, huge, exciting, very exciting. That was it, though. We sort of, the pot boiled over then. It was getting so big. And so, there was a way I was hoping maybe, I've always thought this, I'm sorry, I'm divulging here. I always thought places like this are a waste of time. Cinema is just too good for a place like this. Why do we still get you to sit in seats? You're not allowed to move. You're supposed to sit still. You're supposed to remain quiet. You're not supposed to participate. And you look at a flat screen. You don't have to have a flat screen. You don't have to sit. cinemas have destroyed the potentiality of cinema. We don't need to have events like this in dark, boring places like this. And this has been true at least for now, 20 years. But we're still stuck with this goddamn architecture. So in essence, you know, cinemas are the death of cinema.
I think you're right. It's a revelation. Maybe I should... I'm resigning.
Well, I'm certainly sure, you know, that your days are limited, and your days in cinema, too, are limited.
All our days are limited. That's one of the facts in life, isn't it? Is that, in fact, you've talked to yourself, haven't you, about the two things that, you know, truth is sex and death are the two things, aren't they? And death of cinema is definitely one of the things you've talked about a lot, but you continue to make the films.
That's true.
That was a cheap blow, wasn't it? So I feel really mean now. And talking of which, you have just made you're in the process of getting a project off the ground, which has been advertised with Morgan Freeman and all people attached to it, and that's going through different variations at the moment. But you have made a film called Walking to Paris, which hasn't been released yet, and I know there's still some work to do. But can you just tell us a little bit about that?
I was fascinated by the idea of cinema is basically two-dimensional. And I think that's where it ought to stay. So that's why one of the reasons, Mr. Cameron, I think you're wasting your time with 3D cinema. There are much, much more interesting ways to organize the notion of three-dimensionality. Think of Abel Gance, for example, multiple screens. Yeah. That seems to me a far more profitable pursuit than to sort of play around with this retinal, you know, pseudo-excitement. I'm getting so enthusiastic about this, I'm losing the thread of what I was going to say.
Raining to Paris.
All right. I was fascinated by...
Walking to Paris.
Is it possible... I don't mind you using that title. It sounds even more exciting. Is it possible to really appreciate three-dimensionality in terms of the sculpture's art? You know, there have been, you know, Neolithic sculptures of female figures made extraordinarily in 3 dimension. How is it possible to try and get that language into the cinema? And I became interested in Brancusi, because Brancusi, extraordinary, certainly, you know, mid-20th century sculptor, emerged from the backwoods of Romania. I don't think any of us, I'm sorry, I don't want to insult any Romanians in the audience, but there is a way, the chances of them creating extraordinary languages with the culture that they had, which had just come out of the Soviet era, was pretty slim. And Brancusi decided that if he wanted to become a really important sculptor, he had to go to Paris. But his family were shepherds, had no money whatsoever. If he was ever going to get to Paris, he had to walk there. It's over 2,000 miles, and he did walk there in 1906. And I was curious about trying to recreate that walk. What does he go through? Romania, Hungary, Germany, Austria, Switzerland, and finally, of course, France. Had all sorts of adventures. I cannot prove any of them, but none of you can disprove them. There are no journals, there are no diaries, there were no witnesses. He was a very solitary man. Quite shy, I think, not aggressively shy, as it were. I mean, for example, it was always said if he was faced with crossing a river, he would ignore the bridge and swim across, and he avoided big cities. So it's a film very much about his adventures in wildernesses. So let's think about the notion of the European landscape in 1905. There were no factory farms, no 6-lane highways, completely different place. To our thinking nowadays, with all that we're looking forward to or not looking forward to, is the notion of the European landscape must have been something of a paradise. And I tried to make this film about this walk. It took him nearly 2 years to walk all the way from a village near Bucharest all the way to Paris. And that's really what the film is about. The Greeks had two names for the very beginning and the very ending of life, Eros and Thanatos. I think most cinema deals, do you not agree, with Eros? Innumerable films about first sexual experiences, first love, developing of wisdom, etc. But remarkably few have a relationship or an interest with the end of life, the Thanatos. You might remember Bergman's The Wild Strawberries was a particularly, I think, interesting example. And the film that we are hoping still to manufacture, which is called Luca Mortis, Luca is the name of a city in northern Tuscany, is very much about this. It's about death. And it really asks the impossible question, is death necessary? But it's not a zombie movie. It's not about corpses and coffins and the buzzing of flies. It's about a group of people from New York, of which Morgan Freeman was made to be the major figure, who go looking for his antecedents, his roots, if you like, in northern Italy, and ask questions about, okay, we have, in a sense, the last 3 decades talked endlessly about sex, its politics, its genealogy, its negativity, its positivity, its the insights in medical science about population increase, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And we feel that by talking about it and talking about it and talking about it, we grapple with it and begin to understand all its mysteries and worries and anxieties. What if we did the same about death? Very few people confront death in the year 2022 in a domestic way. I mean, I'm not talking about Russia and Ukraine, terrifying circumstances. So let's talk about suicide. Let's talk about assisted death. Let's talk about euthanasia. But let's talk about it seriously, without sensation, and consider whether, in fact, and we're all living, look at me, I'm sitting here because you're somehow curiously celebrating the fact that I'm 80 years old. The Bible says 70 years and 10.
I think somebody said you're still a baby, I think they just said.
Well, that could be true.
I have to say,
but we're so-called adding years to our lives, but are those years of quality, or is it just simply adding another figure? And the extension of life, considering evolutionary processes, is it even sensible? And the film is really, I suppose, a long essay form of people discussing these issues. I can't say in a remote way I'm coming up with any answers. How could you possibly come up to an answer to a question, is death necessary? But there is a way, it's a conundrum, which I think that we ought to, with all our sense of sophistication, all our medical understanding, the collapse of, should we say, superstition in the world, even, dare I say it, and this could apparently be true now, indeed, of this country, the religious beliefs, etc., are being eroded and feathered away, and there's a big sea change happening. And I want to just be able to discuss these things. And I think I can, because of my age, be allowed the legitimacy to be able to do that. So I hope indeed to be able to finish this, I have to say it, this film sooner rather than later. I think we are all interested, aren't we? Isn't that what cinema and what art is all about? We use artists, cinema makers, to take us to the edges of experience. Not that we want to go there, heaven forbid, but we ask them, we give them permission for them to make the journey on our behalf. And the grotesquerie, the notion, indeed, we mentioned Ukraine, let's mention it again, the grotesquerie of that political activity, which is so appalling, is really part of the area. I think we have to venture there in order to make a greater understanding where most of us, happily, most of the time, live far away from the need or necessity to engage in such unhappy circumstances. Well, if you ever watch the Drosten's contract, you notice the camera hardly ever moves. I don't think it moves at all. That's not quite true. It doesn't move once or twice. But my argument there, and it sounds a bit facetious, paintings don't move. Why should cinema? There is a way, again, I'm making this film, in the 80s, and cinema at that particular time was cut, 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 cut. And I wanted to have very, very long takes, to use theatrical sort of attitudes, and certainly to reprise constantly the efficacy and the excitement of painting.
It has been such a joy for me to have this opportunity to joust with you in a good-natured way, but also learn so much. Your films personally have made a massive impact on my life, and I know a lot of people here today as well. And I just want to say a big, big thank you and a celebratory year. Congratulations on 80, and may there be many, many more years to come. Peter Greenaway, thank you so much.